Evening BookTube. It's been a while. I've been immersing myself in the past month or so in a few biographies of American presidents. And the very first one I'd like to talk about is a very good biography of George Washington by Flexner. James, I believe his name was James Flexner. I've forgotten the name. Let me just double check the name here of this author, Flexner. Just want to make sure I get the little details right. Yes, James Thomas Flexner. So this is a biography of George Washington, which was recommended by the esteemed book critic Steve Donahue, who many of you will know. And I thought I would pick it up and read it, because I don't actually know that much about Washington, or I didn't before I read this biography. I, of course, knew the major details of his life, but I wasn't far from being an expert on his life, or being completely up to date on all of these very thorny aspects of America's founding. I must confess that based on the little bit of information I did have, about Washington, I had a fairly low opinion of him. I felt that his status in American history was to some extent overrated, that to a great degree he has been overly mythologized by a very grateful, understandably so, American public and American body of scholars for being such a big figurehead for the independence movement at that time that was seeking to break away from Britain. And of course, having read Flexner's very capacious and very accessible one-volume biography of Washington, I can say that whilst my cynicism about Washington's supposedly saintly qualities has not entirely diminished, Flexner has gone some way to putting those to bed somewhat. It's quite clear, if you read the history, that for all of his undoubted flaws, there was probably no one else who could have held the fractious movement for independence together, aside from Washington. And if you read his career after 1789, after the successful revolution and the defeat of the British during the American Civil War, it's quite clear from Flexner's account that Washington was perhaps the one man who stood between the destruction of the Republic at the hands of internal discord and the self-interest of so many of its constituent states, and the solidification of the Union behind a constitution, first of all, and behind a centralized system of government. And it's quite clear that had it not been for Washington's ability to navigate diplomatically between the warring political camps of his time, it's unlikely that the United States would have continued to exist and would have gone on to become the great superpower that it is now. So I did find Flexner's account very instructive in this regard, and it also shed a lot of light on aspects of Washington which had been entirely obscure to me. I had no idea, for example, that outside of his military and his political activities, he was also a very intellectually curious farmer. He was very much into different methods of farming that he could use to improve the productivity of his lands. He was bringing all sorts of people over from the continent and from England to assist him in making his farms more efficient. He was incredibly restless. You get the sense from reading the biography that when he wasn't off campaigning in a military campaign against the British or whichever enemy he was assigned to defeat, or if he wasn't involved in the business of running the country, then he was very much occupied with the whole business of making his his lands, his property, as efficient as it could possibly be. And one thing this didn't quite extend to was his slaves. Now, Washington, like every other founding father, did have the sins of slavery on his shoulders. But one thing that marked him out from all the other founding fathers was his distaste for the practice, and not only that, but the fact that towards the end of his life, he was actually making plans to emancipate all of his slaves and his wife's slaves as well. So that was rather interesting to read about. And of course, for those who are quite fond in this modern day and age of tearing down the heroes of the past, like Washington, and destroying their reputations because of all sorts of supposed crimes and evils that we have discovered in our time, are unacceptable and should never be tolerated in any civilized society. Washington, of course, is very much in the firing line because he was the original straight white American male slave owner. And it's become a favorite talking point of those who hate America and those who hate the West in general to use this against the great men of the past, such as Washington. And yet, when you read about the life of this rather extraordinary man, it's quite clear that he was in many ways head and shoulders above his contemporaries, including the much overpraised Jefferson, for just how dedicated he was to emancipation. And he actually supposedly said to a close friend of his that if it came to a war between the South and the North, this was his way of anticipating the Civil War of many decades later, that he would in fact side with the North against the South. And it's quite clear that his sympathies lay clearly in the direction of emancipation, albeit a gradual one, of the slaves, and that he held a deep, deep sense of discomfort for what has popularly become known as America's original sin. So that was rather fascinating to read about. Those who have read a lot about Washington and his life, of course, he needs no real introduction. There's no need for me to go into much detail about how the role he played in the French and Indian War as a very young man, when he single-handedly brought about a world war. I won't bore you with all the intricate military details of the American Revolution, which I'm sure any Americans watching this will already be familiar with, and of course the role he played in keeping the Continental Army together during that rather difficult period. Flexner's biography really gave me a sense of the amount of friction and factionalism that was really rife within the revolutionary camp during this time. The amount of backbiting and sheer dishonesty and double-dealing that Washington had to deal with all sorts of jealous rivals such as Lee and Gates, was quite something to behold. And the way in which he was able to deal with all of this, with a cool head, with diplomacy, with tact, with all of the qualities that made him such an effective leader, even if he was not, in fact, a particularly gifted general. He was no military genius. In fact, there were far more distinguished tacticians and strategists than himself. But as a commander-in-chief, as a figurehead, as a sort of moral beacon for the cause of the revolution, he was perhaps indispensable to the American cause during this time. And perhaps if it had not been for him, it's unlikely that the Americans would have been able to be as united as they were in the face of British imperialism. And it's all the more striking that a man of the South, such as Washington, a man who was from Virginia originally, a man whose natural sympathies you would expect would have been on the side of the slave-holding plantation owners like himself from the South, came towards the end of his life to realize that actually he had more in common in some ways with his northern brethren than he did with his southern brethren. And we see in Washington the growth, really, from this rather insular, parochial, regionalist mindset that many of the colonials had at this time, even those who were opposed to the crown. And we see how he grew past his own prejudices, slowly but surely, and came round to champion the idea of a united nation and a united America behind a single central government serving as the one single authority for all of the states. And I think that so many of the tensions that later would tear apart the Union are anticipated in his early career and were dealt with, I think, rather well and rather decisively by himself. So that is Flexner's biography of Washington. There was this fantastic biography of Lincoln as well, which I read by Ronald C. White Jr. Again, Lincoln, a figure who, although I knew quite a bit about him, I was far from knowing all of the ins and outs of his life, had never read a biography of him. So this was my first time reading an actual biography of this great man, this man who single-handedly, and that is some exaggeration perhaps, but perhaps single-handedly saved the Union from collapse at a time when it was riven with this once burning question of slavery and whether or not its expansion and continued existence was to be permitted within the United States, which of course was founded on ideals which in so many ways contradict the whole idea, the whole concept of slavery. And one thing which White does in this biography is he traces fantastically well the evolution of Lincoln, not just as a politician, but also as a man. The evolution of his mind as he worked out his position on these thorny issues. He was raised in a family of itinerant Americans who made their reputations for being frontiersmen. They had never stayed in one state. They were always wandering around. And from a very early age, he imbibed the deep anti-slavery convictions of his parents. And these stayed with him all his life, even though his actual position on slavery, in terms of the politics of it, was always much more nuanced than he's often given credit for. And it took him a while to come to the position of supporting abolition and the emancipation of the slaves. But when he decided to do that, he was decisive and he was bold in making the argument, in making the case, and in doing away with this horrible institution. And he deserves to be remembered as one of America's greatest ever presidents for that alone, if nothing else. But there was so much else to this man and to this president that has to be admired. His ability to rise above petty, egocentric concerns as president, his willingness to ignore and overlook perceived slights, his willingness to indulge and give second chances to people who had deceived him, betrayed him, disappointed him. People such as McClellan, the hapless commander-in-chief of the Union forces at the early on in the Civil War. His willingness to constantly give these people chances to prove themselves. His willingness to overlook people's character flaws in favor of what he felt were their positives. I felt that this was rather admirable on him, and to think that a man like this, with all the virtues he had not been on the scene. Think of what would have become of America had it not been for someone like Lincoln, gifted with these skills of leadership, these skills of diplomacy and tact, skills which, of course, are completely absent in the buffoon who currently occupies the White House. But what a contrast there is between these two characters, between these two personages of history. I just found this to be riveting reading. And it was also fascinating to learn that despite the reputation that he would go on to get later in his life. And despite the way in which he has been lionized as this ideal of American presidents, actually his early political career was very undistinguished. He lost almost as many elections as he won in his lifetime. For most of his political career, he was a nobody. He was an obscure Illinois congressman that no one cared about. It was only really the debates he had with Stephen Douglas that brought him to national prominence. And he, of course, around that time, graduated from being a leading figure among the Whig Party at that time to becoming one of the leading Republicans. The Whig Party, of course, being the party that was formed in the 1830s in opposition to Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonian Democrats and what they were doing at that time to the country. And this, of course, went on to morph into the Republican Party. And the anti-slavery elements of the Whig Party jumped ship and abandoned the Whigs as the Whig Party collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, and they all became Republicans, and Lincoln was one of them. And the way in which he was able to come from being a nobody to becoming the figurehead and the leader of the Republicans, and then going on to become president, and of course being elected on a mere plurality of the vote because of three-way split that occurred in the vote at that time. It's fascinating when you think about all the circumstances that had to be put in place for him to come out of nowhere to become president. And of course, America is much the better for it. So that was a wonderful read. And then there is, lastly, Barack Obama's capacious memoir, A Promised Land, all about the time he spent in office. This only takes you through the first 3 years of his presidency, or the first 2 years, I should say. A second volume is planned, which will cover, I assume, the rest of it. Obama, of course, a figure who was president during much of my childhood. He is the president who I remember the most from when I was growing up. Of course, his election was a massive boost of inspiration for people like myself, of my skin color, understandably, as a black kid who had political ambitions of his own, albeit in British politics, not in American politics. Certainly his election as the first black president was a historic moment and a special moment for myself and my family. Of course, I would go on to become a bit more mature politically. I would grow beyond those early feelings of excitement I felt for this figure. I'm much more ambivalent about Obama now. I don't share his dizzying idealism. I am much more conservative than he is in terms of my politics and my personal inclinations, and reading this book has only brought home for me just how much of an idealist he is, even though the realities of politics in many ways made him more conservative than he started out as being when he became president. And this book, it really is an education in American politics, in the American presidency, and the limits to how much you can actually achieve in power, the limits to how much any one man can do, even with the best of intentions. Of course, bearing in mind that Obama has a vested interest in this memoir of trying to excuse his failings and give reasons why he couldn't achieve more. But even taking that into account, I find much of what he says here convincing. And this was a very enjoyable read, which I hope will soon be followed by his second volume, and which I will also hopefully take much pleasure from reading. So there you have it. Those are all three of the biographies I've been reading of American presidents over the past month, and I hope that you go away and you read one of them. Bye for now, BookTube.